All right, we're going to start. Everybody who's here, welcome. Glad you're here. Those of you who are joining us online, glad you're online with us tonight. Thanks for tuning in as we go through chapters 3 and 4 of Confronting Christianity, and hope you had a chance to read it. If not, I hope that this overview will help you as you get a chance to go back and read these chapters. Let me pray for our time tonight. Father, thank you for your word. Thank you for the truth of your word. Thank you for this book and how it helps us process these hard questions. Thank you for Rebecca and for her ministry and for her life. I pray that our time tonight would be fruitful, helpful, that it would be in alignment with what your word teaches, and that you would use this to build strength and confidence in our faith and help us be able to interact with people who are skeptics, interact with people who have questions more effectively. Ask these things in your name. Amen. All right, our two topics tonight, the two things we're going to talk about is how can you say there is only one true faith, and doesn't religion hinder morality? Chapters 3 and 4 in Rebecca's book. And at the heart of that first question about how can you say there's only one true faith, you have to understand what are we talking about when we talk about the nature of faith. So I want to lay some groundwork before we dive into what she interacts with and say, here's what we're talking about when we talk about faith. Faith is one of these words that needs to have a context around it because it can mean different things in different contexts. But what she's talking about when she talks about one true faith, she's talking about people processing what makes sense in life. So faith here is, I'm defining this way, man's attempt to make sense of our existence in the world in which we live. How do we make sense of life? And whatever answers you come up with that makes sense for you, that's your faith. So everybody has a faith in something. Some people have a faith in the idea that there's no God and there's no eternity and there's nothing, and that's what they believe. They have faith in that. That's how they make sense of life. Other people process it differently. So we're not talking about necessarily religious dogma. We're talking about how do you make sense of life. Faith deals with questions like, where did we come from? Well, we talked about this a little bit last week. The three essential questions are, where did we come from? Why are we here? What happens when we die? But beyond that, how do we make sense of suffering? How can we tell the difference between right and wrong? These are faith-related questions, and these are the questions she's dealing with in this book. When you're confronted with those questions, you start looking for answers. So when you start to say, okay, what's the meaning and purpose of life? You start to look around and see, how do I figure that out? And so we tend to answer those questions by saying, what does my life experience teach me? So how do I make sense of life? Well, what does living tell me about that? How do I make sense of life? What can I learn from history or from science or from philosophy? What conclusions have other people come to? These are some of the ways we investigate faith questions and try to lock in on our own answer to those things. And in the book, Rebecca makes this point. She says, most religious claims cannot be proved beyond reasonable doubt, at least not until one dies or the world ends. So the idea that they are objective and universal feels like a category confusion. So she's saying, for us to try to lock in and say, here's what faith tells us, there's always going to be a gap between the evidence we have and the conclusion we draw. And that gap is filled in with faith. So I was thinking about this, and I thought about this guy who I had a chance to meet a few years ago. He was a detective with the Torrance, California Police Department for more than 25 years. And his name's J. Warner Wallace. When J. Warner Wallace, he worked with the Metro team, the gang detail, the crime impact team, SWAT team, intelligence detail, and the robbery homicide unit. So he was involved in lots of different criminal investigations. And ultimately, he was one of the founding officers who started the cold case homicide work in Torrance, California. So now we're looking at stuff that's 10 years old and trying to go back and dig up evidence, whatever evidence we can assemble, so that we can see if we can come to a conclusion about what happened back there 10 years ago. And when J. Warner Wallace was 35 years old, somebody challenged him to investigate the claims of Christianity the same way he would do a criminal investigation. He said, take your rules of investigation, your rules of evidence, apply them to the Bible and what it says about Jesus, what history says about Jesus, all of these things, and see what conclusions you come up with. And he was a skeptic, he was an agnostic or an atheist, really didn't have much interest in religion, but he was intrigued by the idea, and so he started to dig in. He said, the more I tried to apply my police investigative skills, the more I came to the conclusion Christianity is making claims that are supportable based on the evidence. So let me ask you a question. If somebody is an eyewitness to a crime, or excuse me, if somebody's not an eyewitness to a crime, you didn't see it happen, and you are either a police investigator or a juror, you didn't see it happen, but you've got to try to figure out what happened, what do? Can you be certain that the accused is guilty if you were not an eyewitness? And J. Warner Wallace would say, you can build enough of a case with the preponderance of evidence that even if you weren't an eyewitness, the likelihood that this person committed that crime rises as the evidence rises. So even juries or policemen or women will come to a conclusion without being an eyewitness. They're not always right, as we know. Some jurors convict somebody only to find out later that they weren't right. They do get it wrong, and yet what they have to do is they have to examine the evidence and test their case against that evidence. So I bring all of that up because J. Warner Wallace says, here's how you have to deal with evidence like this. He says, when skeptics say that the case for Christianity is weak because it can't be built with scientific, testable, physical, forensic evidence, they simply don't know how a criminal case is tried every day in America. So you will have some people who say, well, you can't prove Christianity because you can't scientifically prove the resurrection. You can't prove it with testable, physical, forensic evidence. He says, we understand as police you can do this. He says, everything counts as evidence, including the behavior of the original witnesses, the testimony of those who listened to the statements of the witnesses, the touchpoint corroborative evidence of the archaeology, the internal confirmation of geography, politics, proper nouns, the deficiency of alternative explanations. These are all forms of evidence. They're all used in criminal trials every day. If convictions were dependent on physical forensic evidence, very few cases would ever be prosecuted. He said, my cold cases, for example, are entirely circumstantial and typically employ little or no forensic evidence. I've yet to lose one of those cases because what I've learned, the answer to an important question, what qualifies as evidence, and the answer is everything. Now, I bring all of that up because as we're looking at the evidences for faith and why should we believe what we believe, and specifically tonight, how can we say that our faith is the only way, we have to go and look at the evidence. We have to pressure test the evidence. We have to challenge the evidence. We have to look at every aspect of it. And as J. Warner Wallace looked at it, he came to the conclusion this is a solid case. And that ultimately moved him from skepticism to belief. So the point is, a person tries to grapple with difficult questions in life, they have to look at the evidence that's available and wrestle with it and draw a conclusion. And the gap between what the evidence supports and what the final conclusion is, that's filled in with faith. And you want as little gap as possible. But there's always going to be a gap in some of these metaphysical questions, like we talked about. Everyone looks at where the evidence comes from, or everyone looks at the evidence for where we came from or where we're going, and nobody can build a slam dunk case on where did we come from or where are we going. Christianity can't build a slam dunk case. I think it can build a case that has the highest preponderance of evidence, but you can't repeat it, you can't test it. What happens when you die? Christianity offers an explanation for that. There's no way to test it and get a valid conclusion. So we have to examine the evidence, look as hard as we can, and see, does this conclusion, is it supported by the evidence? Is it the best alternative? Now, I went through all of that because it's at the heart of what Rebecca talks about in chapter 3. Can you say there is only one true faith? The answer is, let's look at the evidence for our faith and other faith and see what we come up with. You have to think like a detective. If we walk into a room and there's a dead body in the room, then we would come along and we would do all the police work and we'd compile the evidence and we would say, the husband did it. Based on the evidence, I believe the husband did it. And we have good, solid evidence for that. And then another detective comes along and says, well, I looked at the evidence and I see it completely differently. I think it's the brother-in-law who did it. Now, here's the question. Can both of these people be right if there's only one perpetrator of the crime? No. You'd have to come up with a conclusion. Either the husband did it or the brother-in-law did it. Third person comes along and says, well, I think it was the maid or the butler. You know, and you end up with this debate where somebody says, I think it was Mr. Green in the conservatory with the rope, and the other person says, well, it was Miss Mustard in the library with the candlestick. They both can't be true. And so he's saying when you think about religious claims, like the claims we're making, it can't be that Jesus is the only Son of God and not the Son of God simultaneously. So when people say, you know, whatever faith suits you, that's fine. You can't draw that conclusion because some of these faiths contradict one another and they can't both be simultaneously true. The reason people buy into the idea that all religions are equally true and lead to God is because they tend to think of religious like consumer products. So they tend to think, well, you prefer Ford and I prefer Chevy. It's just a difference of opinion, but we both drive pickup trucks, so, you know, it really doesn't matter. Well, there's a difference between Ford and Chevy and Christianity and Islam. They can't both be just competing products because they're making claims that are truth claims. Or as Rebecca says, if I say Christianity is true and Hinduism, Islam, and Buddhism are not, is that like saying stop smoking, it could kill you? Or is it more like saying my grandmother's cooking is better than yours? We're not dealing with opinions when it comes to religion. A lot of people will try to say, well, faith is just an opinion matter. It's a matter of opinion. No, it's a matter of evidence plus faith. So we have to reorient the way we're thinking. It's not just, well, this is my opinion, that's your opinion, and we'll both have differing opinions. Well, we can have differing opinions, but there's only one truth. If you watch a prize fight, at the end of the fight, you say, I think he won. The other guy says, I think he won. You can have a nice debate, but at the end of the night, the referee declares, here's who won, and you might go, I really think the other guy won. Well, you can think that all the way home, but in the record book for the rest of your life, it's going to say, you're wrong. The other reason people make faith a subjective choice and not an evidence-based reality is because that lets them off the hook. If I say, well, it's just a matter of opinion, then I don't have to really mess with it or think hard about it. I can just say, you know, you have your opinion, I got my opinion, let's all just get along, and you don't have to worry much with this. Rebecca builds this whole chapter around the story of the elephant. You remember reading that as you read it? This is that famous parable where 4 people are blindfolded and they're each touching a different part of the elephant and they come up with a different conclusion about the elephant. So one person says, well, I think it's a snake because he's holding the trunk. And the other says, I think it's a tree because he's holding the elephant's leg. And they're all coming up with different things. And the narrator of the story pulls back and says, see, they all are touching the elephant in a different place. And so they all draw their own conclusions. They're all right, but they're all wrong. And I remember hearing Tim Keller address this story before, and he said he'd read a great analysis of this story written by a British missionary, a guy named Leslie Newbigin. And Newbigin was a missionary in India for many years. He wrote a book called The Gospel in a Pluralist Society. And he said in the book that he had been confronted with the elephant story over and over again in his missionary work, where people would say, how can you not believe this, you know, with the elephant story? And he said, one day it dawned on him, and he said, well, how can you say you see the whole picture? Nobody sees the whole. The skeptics were saying, how can you say you see the whole picture because nobody sees the whole? Everybody's like a blind man. He said one day he was listening to it and it suddenly hit him. The only way you could know that the blind men were blind is if you saw the whole. So somebody has to see the big picture to be able to conclude that these other poor people only see part of the picture. So the person who says, well, The elephant, one person thinks it's a snake, the other person thinks it's a tree trunk. They're both right. That person is apparently smart enough to be able to conclude that they're both right because he can see the whole. But who can see the whole? Newbegin says, this means he suddenly realized the only way you could possibly know that every religion only sees part of the truth is if you assume that you see all of the truth. The only way you could know religions only see part of the truth is if you assume you have the whole truth, which is the very thing you say nobody has. Newbegin all of a sudden realized how incredibly arrogant and imperialistically intellectual it was to say that all religions are equal. He says there's the appearance of humility when you say, oh, they're all equal, nobody knows the whole truth. But he says, in fact, it's an arrogant claim to a kind of knowledge that is superior to the knowledge that's available to your fellow human beings. Yes, sir. Newbegin is spelled N-E-W-B-I-G-I-N. So the point is, the person who says, all religions are equal is saying, I understand religion better than you do. He's making a truth claim. He's saying, I see the big picture, and I see the elephant as a whole. You just see it as Christianity. Well, that's an arrogant proposition that says, I know better than you do. So the point she fleshes out in chapter 3 is that this elephant paradigm creates more problems than it answers. She said, everyone's truth is truth for them based on she's dealing with this, everyone's truth is truth for them based on the evidence they have approach to faith. She says the first problem is the respect problem. The respect problem is we tend to think that disagreement over meaningful or important issues equals disrespect. That if you and I disagree on something that we both think is important, that I can't disagree with you and respect you at the same time. And she says that's simply not true. In fact, we've got to work harder at making it clear that we can respect people even if we hold a different view than they hold. And that's honestly hard to do. It's hard for us to have mutual respect for people when we hold different views. We see that in our culture today. It's why we have a polarized society, because people who hold opposite views have lost respect for one another. And we have to figure out how can we, in the case of spiritual issues, how can we hold to what we believe and still demonstrate and evidence respect for other people? One of the reasons it's hard is because sometimes the people who come to a different conclusion than we've come to don't respect us. So somebody will hear your view and they'll say, well, that's just stupid. They can attack you, they can be sarcastic with you, they can belittle you. And so we have a tendency to want to respond in kind when somebody does that. And we have to, as we defend our faith, defend it not in an attack mode, but in a mode that says, that demonstrates respect for the person who holds the other view, even if they are not respectful toward us. Second, it's hard to do this because it requires humility, and we're not naturally humble. To hold a different view from somebody and still respect that person requires us to have the humility to say, I don't know everything. I have strong convictions. I believe this is true. But I'm going to be humble enough to acknowledge that I need to listen to the challenges that you have. Third reason it's hard is because there is some fear in us that in order to be holding fast to our faith, we have to dismiss competing arguments. Our job, we think, is not to consider the arguments of skeptics, but to defeat those arguments. And I would suggest that, no, we need to consider the arguments of skeptics. And if our faith can't stand up to the arguments of skeptics, then there's something that we've got to consider. Now, I would say that, and I'd say quickly, that the skeptics have been attacking Christianity for years, and the faith has stood. So just because you can't come up with a good answer on your own doesn't mean there's not a good answer. But we have to get away from the idea that if somebody is throwing out counterclaims against Christianity, that we have to go on the attack and beat them down, or somehow we have to stand firm for the faith. There's an old story about somebody who was invited to debate a skeptic more than 100 years ago. This was a theologian, I forget who the story was, but he was invited to come out and debate this skeptic. And he said, we want you to come out and defend Christianity. And he laughed and he said, defend Christianity? He said, I don't have to do that. He said, just turn it loose. It'll take care of itself. And so we do have to be ready to give an answer for the faith that is within us. We do have to be ready to contend for the faith, but we have to do it with humility and with confidence and with grace for the other person. The last thing I'll say about this is that we're sometimes afraid that somebody, the skeptic, is going to come up with something that's more clever than we can come up with, and they're going to show us up in the middle of the debate. And that may be true in the moment, but like I said, people have been throwing the same stuff at Christianity for years. If you can't come up with an answer for something a skeptic says to you in the moment, that doesn't mean there's not an answer. It just means that you don't know the answer. So you can come back and say, somebody threw this at me, I didn't know how to answer it. That this is where the community of faith helps us. I like what Rebecca says here. She says, to say, I think you're wrong about this, need not be disrespectful or unkind. For Christians who are commanded to love even their enemies, let alone people with whom they merely disagree, it must not be. We have to be able to demonstrate grace and humility and respect for people with whom we disagree. She quotes a seminary professor of hers who said, it is often said that you should respect other people's beliefs. That is wrong. What's vital is you respect other people. So we have to figure out how we can, as we hear their beliefs, show respect for them, even if we come away saying, I sincerely think you are misguided on this. She says, attempting to persuade others to change their beliefs is a sign of respect. You are treating them as if they are thinking agents with the ability to decide what they believe, not just products of their cultural environment. So when you sit down with somebody and say, I'd like to have a conversation with you about what you believe and what I believe, you are really saying, I'm trying to do this not to attack you, but out of respect. And to do that, you have to be as much of a listener to them as you would like them to be to you. So that's the mutual respect. The elephant story doesn't reflect anybody or respect anybody except the all-knowing person who is telling the story. And he's not respecting everybody else because he thinks these simpletons, these rubes, they only know part of the story, and I know the whole story. So that's the problem of respect. The second issue is the truth problem. We've been talking about this when we talk about faith, but Rebecca says we cannot categorize religious belief as purely subjective simply because they are personal. She says, physicist Neil deGrasse Tyson famously quipped to Stephen Colbert, the good thing about science is that it's true whether you believe it or not. But Rebecca says this is not limited to science, it's the good thing about truth. The good thing about history is it's true whether you believe it or not. And the good thing about the resurrection is it's true whether you believe it or not. So this is the problem of truth. Because Christianity is not just making claims of opinion or mythology, Christianity is making truth claims. We can't have competing truth claims that can be simultaneously true. Her third problem is the problem of history. This is connected to the truth problem because what happens in history is, it happens, it's true, and Christianity is a history-based faith. Many other faiths are not history-based. They are based on philosophies or their own mythology. And I'm not, when I refer to these as mythologies, I'm not using a pejorative here because some of these faiths would say, no, our faith is built on our mythical understanding. They see mythology as an important part of their understanding of reality. We look at what the Bible teaches and say this is not mythology, where it's talking about history, it's historical. Now that puts us in places where we see supernatural occurrences, and we have to come to grips with whether we believe in the supernatural. But when we read in the Bible that the Red Sea parted, we don't think that's a myth. We think that's what happened. When we read in the Bible that the sun stood still for a period of time, we don't think that's a myth. People say, well, that wouldn't work physically. And I say, I think the guy who made everything could figure out how to pull that off. So those are the kinds of things we're dealing with, historical claims here. Rebecca says it this way. She says, just as Julius Caesar either was assassinated on March 15, 44 BC or was not, so Jesus either was raised from the dead in circa AD 33 or he was not. Our believing or not believing in the resurrection may change us, but it doesn't change the objective reality of what took place 2,000 years ago. Either Jesus did rise from the dead or he didn't. That's a truth claim. That's not an opinion claim. And for Christians around the world to say, I believe that's true, and somebody else to say, well, if that's true for you, I don't believe it, but that's fine if it's true for you. They're saying, if you want to believe your myth, you can. And we're saying it's not a myth, it's historical. So that is the history problem. The next problem that you come up with is I got two here, didn't I? The conversion problem. And here is, her point is that the demonstrated transformation that Jesus makes in the life of believers is a reality of faith. Christianity is not just a belief code that a certain tribal group embraces. Believing in Jesus actually changes peoples. It's not an ethical code. It's not like a constitution, or it's not rules to live by that people sign on to. It actually has a transforming impact in the lives of people. So in order to say all religions are the same, there would have to be some evidence that all religions have that same power. Then the ethics problem, here's where people embrace this all road lead to God. They run into a problem with the ethics problem, and that is, if my road to God, if my path to God leads me to embrace torture and rape as a part of my personal ethics, can we say, well, that's okay for you? Can we simply dismiss some of these ethical challenges? Can we simply pass this along and say, well, it's open-minded to believe that if that works for you, that's okay? They'll usually say it works for you as long as you do no harm to another person. But then when you start to say, well, I think marriage ought to be between a man and a woman, I think that's the right way for marriage to be understood in the culture, these people will say, well, we reject your faith because we believe that what you're doing brings harm to other people. Now all of a sudden, they're the ones who are deciding whether what you believe hurts or not. They become the hurt police. So pluralism in religion is fine with them, but pluralism in ethics is not, and that's part of the ethics problem you have here. The last one is the monotheism problem that she talks about. The world's three monotheistic religions all affirm this to be true. There is one God. So Judaism teaches that, Islam teaches that, Christianity teaches there is one God. Other religions teach no, there are many gods. So if we're saying all religions are equally valid, how can they be equally valid when they contradict one another? When one group says there's only one God and the other group says no, there are a lot of gods, one of those things is either true or not true. Jesus himself, and by the way, this is the last problem, it's the Jesus problem. Jesus himself is the one who claimed exclusivity. He's the one who said, I'm the way, the truth, and life. Nobody comes to the Father but by me. You can't see Jesus as a good and wise teacher and then dismiss the claims he makes about exclusivity and about him being the only way. He can't be a good and wise teacher who lies to you about being the only way or who is deluded. This is where C.S. Lewis came up with the famous trilogy, the three conclusions. When Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, nobody comes to the Father but by me, he is either telling the truth or he's lying. Lewis says, if he's telling the truth, if he's lying, he either knows he's lying or he doesn't know he's lying. So if Jesus says, I'm the way, the truth, and the life, he's not telling the truth, but he doesn't know he's not telling the truth. Then he's just a madman. He's a fool. He's not smart enough. He's saying things he doesn't understand. He says, maybe he's not telling the truth, and he knows he's not telling the truth. Well, that would make him a liar. So if he's telling the truth, you can't be telling the truth and not know you're telling the truth. He's telling the truth. He knows he's telling the truth. He is who he says he is. He's either, as Lewis said, liar, Lord, or lunatic. And the Jesus problem is that all religions can't say Christianity is equally valid when the head of what we believe says, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but by me. How can you say our religion is valid when you say he's a liar or he's a lunatic? So those are the 7 problems with the theory that she outlines in the book. It all goes back to the idea that we're dealing with an evidence-based faith. So thoughts or questions, if you're a skeptic, if you're looking at this, anything that somebody's thrown at you or anything that you'd pop up with here that you'd say, I either want to add this or what about this? Anybody got anything here? Yes.
I always thought it was interesting with Lewis when I was younger that he said those three, and I always thought there was a fourth, legend.
Huh.
And I guess because if you really look at the evidence in history, that's not an option.
Right.
So
Yeah.
logical is the legend, but he never considered that because he's like, that's not a thinking person.
So Larry's bringing up the point for those of you at home. He says, it's liar, lord, lunatic. He said, what about legend? So this would be somebody who is telling his mythology. He's telling the truth in a mythological way, but he knows it's not literal truth. But like we said, Christianity is a truth-based religion. It's an historical-based religion, so it doesn't deal with mythology, and that's why that one, I think, is left out. Good point, yeah. Well, there is that. So there are some people who have decided, Jesus, and Dwayne says, there are people who just say, well, I don't think he said that. And I would say, based on what? And their answer is based on the fact that I don't like that he said it. It's not based on scholarship. It's not based on exegesis. It's not based on historical. The Jesus Project, which was a group of scholars that came together and went through to try to determine what are the actual things in the New Testament that Jesus actually said, and they came up, they said 10 to 20% of what he said was actually true. Well, how did they determine that? They determined it based on, they picked the things that made the most sense to them. And they dismissed anything that had any supernatural overtones. And this is where, when somebody says, well, I just don't think Jesus really said that, you just say, and why don't you think that? Well, I don't think Jesus would say that. Why don't you think that? Because I think that's too narrow-minded. So you're saying that you believe Jesus would not be narrow-minded, and this is narrow-minded. You're basically saying, I think Jesus would think like me. So now who's Lord, right? Pat.
One of the things she says that's helpful is respecting the person, not just the belief, but that's in the context that leads to the kind of discussion. I remember Francis Schaeffer once saying, you carry every presupposition to its logical conclusion. And so to be able to engage somebody at that level of discussion without, well, at least with minimal
Yeah.
hostility, you're almost acting like a lawyer, and you have to be willing to engage. What Schaeffer said is you had to take their argument, work your way through it using the question process like she's speaking about, and then be willing to stand back and graciously but kindly say, this is where you are.
Right.
But you really have to, I find it not common to be able to engage people at that level because, number one, so many people don't even have the kind of support for what they believe that they can articulate.
Right.
So pretty early on in the process, you're almost defeated. Not that you're defeated, but you have to help them see what they believe or what they say they believe before you can actually
Yeah. Let me say what Pat said for everybody who's watching at home. So he basically said these kinds of respectful interactions are very difficult because oftentimes people they have a shallow understanding, so you can't really have robust engagement, and oftentimes to do it effectively, we have to be able to listen effectively to what people are saying. I may have said this last week, but I believe engagement can't happen until you can state the other person's position in a way that the other person would say, yes, that's what I believe. So you need to be gracious enough, careful enough to be able to do that. But you're right, these kinds of respectful engagements are not easy.
But the point is, they can't articulate
Right.
support for their reasons.
Yeah.
So you have to kindly help them.
They can't see their own viewpoint. They're thinking at a shallow level. Becca.
But they don't need to. This is the problem. It's from a postmodern or post-truth perspective. You don't need to be able to So if it makes sense to me and it works for me, it doesn't matter whether it makes sense or whether my ideas contradict one another or whether you don't like it. I'm creating the world in my own image, and you should go do the same. And if we end up not getting along,
It's postmodernity more than it's existentialism, but the two overlap at a level. So yeah, there's existentialism is saying all there is existence, and I'm here, and this is ultimate and ultimate meaning and reality. But postmodernism started there, and I should just turn the mic over to Becca, who's been teaching this to high school students for the last 12 years, and postmodernism started back with guys like Foucault and Derrida, who said, it's not what the writer meant to say that matters, it's what the reader gets out of it that matters. That's truth. Well, the Supreme Court has a very postmodern approach on some of this. So you're not trying to figure out what was he meaning to say, you're reading it and saying, what does that mean to me, or what does that say to me? And then that's truth.
the idea is, if we break it down, that you're not allowed. Okay, so the 2-minute version is a modernist is somebody who believes that there is a particular truth claim that you can use as the foundation for an entire structure or system of truth. Okay, that could be Jesus Christ is who he says he is, and the Bible is the source of our information about him. It could be
The sky is blue.
the sky is blue. It could be existentialism, right? All you have is your own experience. Whatever the claim is, right? These are modernist philosophies. Derrida comes along and he says, you've taken all these privileged ideas, these truth claims, that you're using them to build different systems of competing ideologies. You're no longer allowed to have those central claims. You're not allowed to privilege any idea over any other idea. So while there may be something out there that exists that is quote unquote truth, none of us have access to it. Now, yes, we're all thinking about the elephant going, he's the guy who says he sees the whole thing.
Right.
Right? But if you don't take that step back, you have two now generations of young people whose baseline assumption is that and it can't be lived out, right? We're not trying to say somebody can actually do this way or live this way. But the philosophy behind it is, I can't act like one truth claim is any more or less true than any other truth claim. They're all equal, and people piece together the claims that resonate with them, and that's as much truth as you can hope to have. As long as your truth claim doesn't seek to oppress anyone else's truth claim. And that's where the Marxism and the
Cultural theory and
theory comes into the picture.
yeah. So I'm not going to try to repeat what Becca just said, but it's absolutely right, and it's the idea that we live in a culture where the idea of objective reality and objective truth has been marginalized and dismissed, and so you try to sit down and have a conversation about ultimate reality and truth, and at some level people are going to come back to you and say, well, that's true for you, and they're happy with that answer, and case is closed for them. It doesn't matter what else you say after that. They'll just say, well, that's true for you.
Now, sorry, Bob, but
Yeah.
now, contemporary culture, before it used to go, that's your truth. That's
Right.
But now, your truth oppresses me.
Right.
I'm gonna cancel you out.
Yeah. So Pat's making the point that it used to be that it's you have your truth, I have my truth, we can live in peace. Now it's you have your truth, I have my truth. It's both true, but if your truth is oppressive in any way, now we're canceled.
Just an interesting point related to that is back when the Judeo-Christian ethic was the majority worldview, you've heard the word tolerance.
Right.
You don't hear the word tolerance
Yeah.
anymore because it's not the cultural
Yes.
mainstream view, and they don't want tolerance.
Mike's point is that we're moving from what used to be tolerance to now, no, we're not going to tolerate anything that we deem as oppressive. Yes, Keith.
And by that,
Right.
and it's okay. Or, sexual assault or whatever. I mean, people can espouse that, but they don't really.
Which gets right into the next chapter where it's talking about morality and ethics. Keith's point is that people will say, well, truth claims are all relative until you start to say, I think racism is okay. They go, well, no, of course that's wrong. So now all of a sudden that's a truth claim that we hold on to. So they don't live it out consistently. Let me just read this to wrap up chapter 3. This is from 2 Timothy 2, and this is something I come back to all the time. This is Paul coaching Timothy as a young pastor, and he says to Timothy, have nothing to do with foolish, ignorant controversies. You know that they lead to quarrels. And I would say, as you're engaging with skeptics, you can tell the difference between somebody who just likes the intellectual volley and somebody who's really having a conversation to try to investigate. If all it is a quarrel, don't waste your time. Jesus said, don't cast your pearls before swine. If it's just an intellectual exercise, there's nobody really listening, you're just having sport, don't waste your time. Have nothing to do with those things. But he says, the Lord's servant must not be quarrelsome. Kind to everyone, able to teach, patiently enduring evil, correcting his opponents with gentleness. God may perhaps grant them repentance leading to a knowledge of the truth, and they may come to their senses and escape from the snare of the devil after being captured by him to do his will. 2 Timothy 2, the last 4 verses in that chapter. And I'll just point out, he's talking to a pastor in training. I would say that we're all the Lord's servant, and that applies to all of us, that we're not to be caught up in controversies and in quarrels. It's okay to be engaged with people where there's sincere interaction going on, but as soon as it turns into just a sparring match, I'd say this is not productive for either of us. But be patient, be kind, endure evil, be gentle as you correct. These are important words for us in this day in particular. Okay, we're going to get into the next chapter. I got to go back to my notes. The next chapter, doesn't religion hinder morality? She really has 2 big ideas in this chapter. First, religious people are not less ethical or less moral than their secular counterparts. In fact, the data suggests that religious people are more ethical and more moral than their secular counterparts. So people who would say to you religion is bad for morality, the data doesn't support that. But the second underlying idea she has here is that when you try to uncouple ethics and morality from religious belief, you run into all kinds of problems. Which brings us to a little bit of a philosophical understanding. We need to look at some background as we get into this chapter. So I would doubt you can recognize this guy by his picture. You know who that is, Becca? Can you tell who that is? He's kind of a dandy. That's Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant. Let me just say about Kant. So for most of human history, there has always been a perceived connection between ethics and morality and religion. So people understood that our understanding of good and evil is not what we say it is, it's what somebody higher or better, a god or gods determine what's right and wrong, what's good and evil. Now, in the late 1600s and into the 1700s, we had in Europe what's been referred to now as the Age of Enlightenment or the Age of Reason. And during this season, people wanted to get rid of God, but they recognized the need to keep ethics and morality around. And so they began to say, well, you can be moral and ethical without being a religious person. You don't have to believe in God to be a moral and an ethical person. And one of the first to propose this uncoupling of theism and ethics was Kant. He's a German philosopher from the 1700s. He advanced the idea that good and evil don't come from revelation outside of us, they come from reason and can be found in us. And if we will just explore these things rationally and reasonably, we will come to a clear understanding of what's right and wrong, what's good and evil. Reason is your path that gets you to good and evil. Morality, then, he said, is a function not of religion, but of reason. He was not particularly anti-religion. what marked him was a desire to untether the two. And by the way, as he saw them becoming untethered, Kant used reason to come up with some ethical conclusions that we would look at today and go, you got to be kidding me. For example, Kant says, children born out of wedlock, a child that comes into the world apart from the marriage is born outside the law and therefore outside the protection of the law. The Commonwealth can ignore its existence since it rightly should not have come to exist in this way, and can therefore also ignore its annihilation, its murder. Kant, using reason, says if a child's born outside of wedlock, it's okay for the culture to decide to dispose of it. It shouldn't have been here in the first place. That's reasonable, right? Well, it depends on whose reason you're using, and there's the rub. When Kant and his contemporaries, people like David Hume, broke the link between morality and deity and started proposing you don't need religion to be a moral person. And by the way, that's not all wrong, because you and I both know people who are ethical, moral people who don't believe in God, and we know people who profess belief in God who don't demonstrate a level of ethical, moral behavior that Christianity prescribes. But what's happened since Kant's day is that some people have begun to see religion not just as not needing, or ethics and morality not needing religion. They've now started to see religion as being harmful or ethically or morally wrong. All people would be better off if they would uncouple from God. They would come to a higher level of morality. That's the view that's being espoused in our day. John Lennon espouses that view, right? Imagine there's no heaven. Imagine there's no God. It's easy if you try. No wars, just love and peace. Imagine all the people living life as one. You may say I'm a dreamer. I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join me and the world can live as one. That's his philosophy. Rebecca quotes a Nobel Prize winner in her book. 1999, Steven Weinberg won the Nobel Prize in Physics, and he said this. He said, religion is an insult to human dignity. With or without it, you would have good people doing good things and evil people doing evil things. But for good people to do evil things, that takes religion. So he's saying when a person becomes a religious person, they don't get better, they get worse. They don't start doing better things, they don't start leading better lives, they start leading more evil lives. He says non-religious people, if they're good people, they're going to do good things. If they're bad people, they're going to do bad things. Religion doesn't matter in all of that. But when somebody turns to religion, they're more likely to do bad things. Chapter 4 acknowledges the fact in Rebecca's book that there is a lot of harm that has been done in our world in the name of Christianity. We've got to acknowledge the fact that people have used Christian justification to do morally evil things. Chattel slavery in our culture, in our country, was justified using the Bible. And that's a moral evil. But the idea that religion somehow makes people less moral or less ethical does not stand up to scrutiny. In fact, Rebecca says there is substantial evidence that religious practice correlates with a range of moral goods. Now here we have to be on the same page that we think these are morally good things. But for example, she says literally hundreds of studies link religious participation with better moral outcomes. For example, sociologist Christopher Ellison and Kristen Anderson discovered levels of domestic violence in a U.S. sample were almost twice as high for men who did not attend church versus those who attend once a week or more. Now, here's where we're believing that domestic violence is a moral evil. So we start with that premise, and if that's true, people who go to church are less likely to do that than people who don't go to church. That's empirical evidence. Going to church regularly does not make you more likely to be a spouse abuser. Are there people who go to church regularly who abuse their spouse? Yes, there are, and that's wicked and that's evil, and we should call it that. But it's not going to church that makes them more likely to do that. There are people in the culture who are doing that who don't go to church. She also points out religious participation has been linked to lower rates for 43 other crimes. The more likely you are to be in church, the less likely you are to commit any of these 43 crimes. And she says in North America, regular church service attenders donate 3.5 times the money given by their non-religious counterparts every year, and they volunteer more than twice as much. So you're less likely to beat your spouse, you're more likely to give money away, and you're more likely to volunteer if you're a regular churchgoer than if you're not. That's the empirical evidence. And I love the part in the quote where she said, some people will say, well, the people aren't going to church. They look at their taxes. They're giving their money to the government to do the social good. And she says, so explain to me why they don't donate blood at the same level as the religious people donate blood. She says, when it comes to a robust philosophical foundation for human rights from a secular perspective, the building materials are hard to come by. I skipped over this. The big issue she's tackling here is that if you use reason as your source of morality, and you think all people will come to the same moral conclusion if they're just reasonable people, why is it that different societies have different moral codes? Why is it that we can read Immanuel Kant talking about the non-humanity of babies out of wedlock and be horrified at that when he was just being reasonable? And the reason is, she says, when it comes to a robust philosophical foundation for human rights, if all you have available is a secular perspective, you don't have the building blocks to build a philosophy for human rights. If you don't believe in God or in the dignity of man as created in the image of God, then why should I treat you with any dignity? That's the point she's making. When you take away deity or divine revelation as the source of morality or ethical behavior, take away the idea that people are created in the image of God and that they have value and dignity as a result of that, what you're left with is very little to make a case for human dignity. In fact, she points to this guy, Peter Singer, as an example of somebody who follows his worldview to its logical conclusion. You got to give Peter Singer credit because he is consistent in what he believes. He doesn't believe in God. He doesn't believe that human beings have any special status over other animals. And he carries that to a logical conclusion. He's an Australian-born philosopher. He holds the chair in bioethics at Princeton. And according to Singer, people's value is not based on some abstract idea like the image of God. It's based on their utilitarian value. So you have worth or dignity if you demonstrate that you're good for something. If you don't demonstrate that you're good for something, then that minimizes your worth or value. And she summarizes Singer's philosophy here. She says, rather than basing human worth on the unique status of Homo sapiens, Singer argues that beings should be valued according to their capacities, their self-awareness, their ability to suffer, and so on. So the better you are at these things that he thinks are your capacities, the more value you have. By Singer's calculation, a week-old baby is not a rational or self-conscious being. There are many non-human animals whose rationality, self-consciousness, and awareness capacity are higher. They exceed that of a human baby a week or a month old. Therefore, the life of a newborn baby has less value than the life of a pig, a dog, or a chimpanzee. Now, what I love about this is it's consistent. And she tells the story about somebody who sat under Singer's lecture and came away going, that's not what I believe. But she saw that if you have an atheist worldview, if your understanding of human dignity is not grounded in the Imago Dei, that you're made in the image of God, then this is the conclusion you come to, that human beings are evolved life forms. Yeah, you see it playing out in the culture. That's right. And I was in high school back when the lifeboat game was rolled out. So if you weren't, the famous lifeboat game was where you'd be in a class and they would tell you that there are 8 people in the lifeboat, and they would describe them to you. There's a newborn baby, and there's an old grandmother, and there's a Nobel Prize-winning scientist, and there's a politician, and there's a very wealthy person. They'll put them all on the lifeboat, but there's only supplies for 4. And so we got to toss 4 people overboard if we're going to save the other 4. So then you have a class discussion. Who should we toss overboard? Do you toss over the baby? Well, it doesn't have much. Singer would. Not enough utilitarian value here. You toss over grandma because she's going to die pretty soon anyway? Well, Singer would. But these are the kinds of moral calculations. If you don't pull back and say every human being has worth and value and dignity, is created in the image of God, whether that's an embryonic child in the womb who's been diagnosed with Down syndrome has equal value with the most important person with Mother Teresa, with whoever you want to pick. There's equal worth, dignity, and value in every human being. And every human being has higher equal worth and value than the other animals. That we are different by God's design than the other animals who do not have the Imago Dei. PETA is an organization that believes that the animals have equal dignity and value with us as animals because they reduce us to being just other animals. She also points out this. I loved this in the book. I highlighted this, and this is one of those things you ought to highlight this, and the next time you're sitting down with a skeptic, you can pull this out. This is from Alex Rosenberg, who is a professor. I'll pull him up in a minute. A professor of philosophy at Duke. He published The Atheist Guide to Reality, Enjoying Life Without Illusions. So he says, here's what atheists ought to logically believe. Is there a God? No. What is the nature of reality? Whatever physics says it is. He's an empiricist. It's only evidence-based. What's the purpose of the universe? There is none. Well, why does he believe that? Because there's no God. This is consistent atheism. What's the meaning of life? There is none. Same as this. What's the purpose of the universe? There's not any. What's the meaning of life? There isn't any. Well, why am I here? It's just dumb luck. Does prayer work? Of course not. Is there a soul? Is anything immortal? Are you kidding? Is there free will? Not a chance. What happens when I die? Everything pretty much goes on as before except you. What's the difference between right and wrong, good or bad? There's no difference between them. Why should I be moral? Because it makes you feel better than being immoral. But I'd have to say, well, what if being immoral makes me feel better? Well, we can talk about the long-term value, your hedonism there, but is abortion, euthanasia, suicide, paying taxes, foreign aid, anything else that you don't like, is that forbidden, permissible, or sometimes obligatory? Anything goes. This is a consistent, non-theistic worldview. How do you get ethics and morality when you don't start with the premise that comes from outside of you, that somebody who created us is the author of these things? And I would love to sit down with a skeptic or an atheist and say, let me just walk you through this, and I want to ask you the question, do you agree with him? And you may disagree, but we'll start. Is there a God? No. All right. Does life have meaning and purpose? And they say, well, I think it does. Okay, help me understand where the meaning and purpose comes from if there's no God, if you're just a more highly evolved life form. And Rebecca juxtaposes in the book 2 professors from MIT. The first one is Alan Lightman, who's an agnostic, and he says this about human beings. He says, our self-consciousness and our self-awareness create an illusion that we're made out of some special substance, that we have some kind of special ego power, some I-ness, some unique existence. But in fact, he says, we're nothing but bones, tissue, gelatinous membranes, neurons, electrical impulses, and chemicals. We are a bunch of atoms like trees and like donuts. So eat a donut or eat a child. Anything goes. Now, we read that and recoil. He's being intellectually consistent. But she compares that with another professor from MIT, who comes to a different conclusion. And what's this guy's name? Did I write down his name? Yeah, Ian Hutchinson. It's right there on the screen. He says, I am an assembly of electrons and quarks interacting through quantum chromodynamics and the electroweak forces. I don't understand any of this, right? But he says, I am this fearfully and wonderfully made assembly of all of these things. I am a heterogeneous mixture of chemical elements. I am a system of biochemical processes guided by genetic codes. But I am also a vast and astoundingly complex organism of cooperating cells. I am a mammal with hair and warm blood. I am a person, a husband, a lover, a father, and I'm a sinner saved by grace. So both of these guys, MIT professors, one of them says, if all you do is see yourself as interconnected gelatinous membranes, then how will you ever come up with an ethical code that values right and wrong? Can it ever be anything other than survival of the fittest? Or as I used to tell my boys, actually all my kids when I was growing up, Nietzsche comes along and says, there is no God, and we are all just higher evolved life forms, so live consistently with that and just do whatever you want. Make absurd choices because there's no reason to be anything other than absurd. If there's no God, Nietzsche is right. If there's no God, these guys who say, eat a donut or eat a kid, it doesn't really matter, they're right. The reason we have ethics and morality built into us is because there's a God who from outside of us, by revelation, not by reason, says, no, there is something higher. So she ends this by saying today's secular humanism offers a worldview which morality and reality are at odds. She says, human beings are a collection of atoms laboring under a false belief that they are even moral agents, and yet humans are of immense, equal, and inalienable worth. How can we believe both of those things simultaneously? That's the problem that the secular worldview, the atheistic worldview has. Are we atoms who somehow think we're moral agents when we're not, and yet are we of immense equal value and worth? How can we have human rights if all we are is just higher evolved life forms? Why does it matter? Why do any lives matter? To borrow a phrase, right? Pat.
A couple of things on Lepine, the fellow who said eat a donut to your child.
Yep.
These guys know that they have to say that to be consistent with their presupposition. And they know it violates everything within them. Because when you're talking to someone like that, you're talking to someone who is a creature, created in God's image, with a conscience, fallen, and in rebellion against God. So this isn't just an intellectual debate, because you can appeal to him and fault his arguments or answer his arguments well. But again, like Schaeffer used to say, give an honest answer to every honest question and be civil and debate it. But he would, and I heard him say this numerous times. After he was done, he would say, but that's really not the issue.
Mm-hmm.
The issue is we're creatures created in God's image and in rebellion against him.
Yeah.
Until we get that sorted out, none of these other things are going to make sense, because there's no way that a fellow who says eat a donut or eat a child, anything goes.
Yeah.
There's no way that person, they might be content with their intellectual consistency, but not their moral. Internally, they can't be content with their moral.
Yeah, Pat's making the point, for those of you who are watching us at home, he's making the point that hopefully my mic is picking some of this up as people are talking here, because they're saying great stuff, but he's making the point that people who would be intellectually honest about what they believe, Peter Singer and the rest, they're intellectually consistent, but their personal morality won't allow them to go there. So the guy who says eat a donut, eat a child is not having kids for breakfast, right? He's still eating donuts, but something in him says, no, I can't eat a child. And this is what Romans 1 tells us, right? Romans 1 tells us that people who deny that there's a God are actively suppressing what they know is true. See, the atheist is working hard to push down what inside he knows is true. And so this is the tension he's living with, is trying to find a comfortable spot where he can live with what he knows is a lie, and he will build, claiming themselves to be wise, they become as fools in this process as they work hard to construct a way to live that is foolishness, but they give it scientific or philosophical respectability and then cling to it as their badge of honor. But still inside of them, they know this isn't really true. And that's what we need to be dealing with, is the reality of their rebellion, not so much the fallaciousness of their argument, although that will be seen, but they need to understand they don't reject God objectively, they reject God morally, and then they support it with their thinking or their structure. Larry.
So I think Sproul has said, take his wallet.
Yeah, that's right.
What would be their response to that? Because exactly what you're saying is that intellectually they think this.
Yeah.
By golly, my wallet's mine.
Yeah. So somebody who says, yeah, morality is just what's right for you is right for you, or that we're just evolved. R.C. Sproul has said, well, take their wallet and see how they respond to that. And they'll feel differently about what's right and wrong in that situation. Kathy. Yeah, Ravi Zacharias saying, just leave your doors unlocked. Why do we lock? Because we know that people are evil, that it's an impulse in our own heart. So, two good questions here. Why can we say Christianity is exclusive? Because it's a truth-based claim. Not because it's a mythology, not because it's our preferred way of seeing things, because we're saying, like a police detective, there is evidence. You examine the evidence in the world, you examine the evidence in the Bible, and you will, if you give it an honest, objective evaluation, you'll come away with a preponderance of evidence, and then you fill in the gap with faith. And the people who say, well, I examined it and I reject it, they've rejected it not because the evidence is not there to support it, but because they didn't like the conclusion it took them to. That's the moral choice that they're making at that point. So that's the first thing that she's saying in terms of the exclusivity of our faith. And then the second thing that she's talking about here tonight when she talks about the link between ethics and morality and a theistic or a Christian worldview, you can't separate them. You can't say right and wrong come from reason. And yet people are trying to do that and trying to come up with that and hold on to it consistently. And it breaks down on a number of levels. And the outcomes of people who live by faith, walk by faith, attend church, who are a part of a community like this, that better ethical outcomes if we believe things like not committing crimes, not being involved in domestic violence, if we think those are good ethical outcomes, people who are faith-based tend to do better on those outcomes than others. That's the conclusion. Yeah, Larry.
This is a real name, but that one quote is really bothering me.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if the ID murder is in quotes. Did he actually say that someone later on, because
Yeah.
he admit that he's saying murder.
So
It's big time evil to me, and that's just bothering me.
the actual Kant quote, and Larry's bringing up the Kant quote, and I'll see if I can pull it back up here and we can get to old. Yeah. I got to go all the way back through all of this to get to him. So somebody else put in the murder there. So he said, can therefore ignore its annihilation. And somebody was saying what he means by that is murder. He was smart enough not to say murder, but what other interpretation can you give to have not come to exist in this way, they can therefore ignore its annihilation? Yeah, annihilation is a technical term. Murder is, yeah. But that's what they're arguing against. And that's just one quote from Kant where you go, if reason is where you're getting your ethics and these are the ethical conclusions you're coming from, nobody would follow Kant today once they start reading what he believed about all of this. Yeah, Keith.
Just a couple of small points. And granted, I agree that when you're talking to people about things like this, it has more to do with spiritual reasons rather than logical reasons.
Yes.
For example, example, people.
See if that mic will pick you up.
Okay.
Okay,
Oh,
all right.
I was thinking, to these people that say there's nothing transcendent within, the scientist that she quotes. There's nothing transcendent within human beings. I mean, but you would have to be transcendent to know that.
Yeah.
And obviously, some of those guys are. What's the correct term? Is it just hard imperialists?
Empiricists, yeah.
Yeah, scientific
Right.
imperialists. I'm sorry, empiricists is what I meant to say.
Yeah.
I mean, they obviously can't prove scientifically that there's nothing outside of science.
Right.
So
They've
obviously-
chosen to believe. An empiricist is somebody who chooses to believe only that which is material or evidentially based. So if you
Right.
can't show me, if I can't access it through my senses, then there's no reason to believe it exists or it's real.
But you also, by that, can't prove that it's not.
Right.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
you would, again, like I say, you would have to be transcendent to know that there's nothing transcendent.
Right.
So, yeah. So, okay.
And Debbie, you had a question or comment?
May sound very simplistic, but I think all this is a magnificent example of God either reveals it to you or
Yeah.
He doesn't. And we are blind or God gives us eyes. And obviously all these people didn't have the eyes to see, nor did they have the heart to look and
Right.
examine it.
And Debbie's point, I think all of you heard it maybe at home, but this is where the things of God, the Bible says, are foolishness to those who are perishing. The things of God are a stumbling block to the Jew and their foolishness to the Greek, but to those who are being saved, it's the revelation of God. It's the glory of God. And we have to understand that we look at this stuff and we go, this ought to be self-evident. It would not be self-evident to us if it weren't for the Spirit of God giving us the gift of illumination. That we don't believe these things because we're smarter, better. We believe these things because the Spirit of God has given us illumination. We believe they're true. And so we ought to be humbled. And that when we're talking to somebody who is a skeptic, we ought to walk away from that conversation going, I would be the same as you if I did not have the illuminating work of the Spirit for me to understand it differently. And that ought to give us compassion and kindness toward that person. Last comment, Pat.
Well, just sort of to recap something, it's easy to be. Hello? It's easy to be intimidated in some of these things because, I'm grateful. I've got a daughter who can teach me all these things I don't understand about historical philosophy and all those things. But I think it's really, really good to engage people to the degree that I'm able on these really profound, significant issues. But even when I can't, or when my understanding and ability have reached their limitation in the discussion, going back to that Romans 1 reality, that's really where it's at. Because someone who's rationally minded, you can give them all kinds of argumentation, and ultimately they're going to go, you might be right.
Yeah.
And you can evidentially minded, you can give them all kinds of evidence and the same thing, you might be right. But when you say to them, you're a creature created in God's image, and you're in rebellion against him, and unless you repent, you will face him in judgment.
Yeah.
And say it lovingly and kindly and compassionately. But that's, it's one thing to toss away facts or evidences. It's another thing to be confronted with that kind of ultimate reality,
Yeah.
and respond to it.
The crowd that turned against Jesus turned against him not because of his ethical teaching, but because of his claims about deity and because of his claims about being the Lord of eternity and he can judge the quick and the dead.
They had all kinds of evidence right before
That's right.
their eyes.
They had all the evidence. Well, Father, thank you for this time tonight. Thank you for these friends and for those who have joined us online. And I do pray that you would help all of us humbly hold to the truth and be ready to give an answer for the hope that is within us. Help equip us through this study to be able to address these issues in our own life where we have questions on these issues, to see that there are answers that make sense, and help equip us to talk to others who are skeptics or who are confused or who are doubting, and to be able to help them see what your word teaches. But we confess here tonight and agree with what Pat just said, that ultimately these issues are not issues of reason, they're issues of spiritual rejection. And so, Lord, we pray for softened hearts, especially in our time, in our day, when our world is in such turmoil. Would you, by your Spirit, bring a wave of soft hearts? Would you cause people to repent and turn to you and to cry out to you and see you as our only hope in the midst of the confusion and the turmoil we're in? Thanks for this time and for the team that's helped us out here tonight. We pray your blessing on this time and on the video. We pray it in your name. Amen. Keep socially distanced as you leave the building. Put your masks back on if you've had them off, and we'll interact with one another that way. See you all next week. Thanks for coming out.